Kia ora, my name is Erin Stroud and I am the host of our Starting in Science series here at SIS. Today we will be talking about what a science career actually looks like. From gumboots to lab coats to boardrooms, science can take you down a diverse and exciting career path. But how do we make this a reality? If, like me, you're just starting out in your science career, or you're already in science but looking to broaden your horizons, this is the episode for you. Today, I'm joined by a very exciting panel who have had very exciting and varied careers. So let's get started today by asking our panel to introduce themselves and how they got into their science careers, starting with Dr. Nick Waipara.
Ngā mihi koutou katoa, ko Nick Waipara tēnei, te uri ahau e te tairāwhiti, ko Puketapu te mana, ko te ara te awa, ko ronga whakaata te iwi, ko Nick Waipara toko ingoa. So, morena koutou. The question was, how did I get into science?
Yes.
My grandfather.
Ah.
Yeah, I used to apparently follow him around. He was a farm advisor for the Ministry of Agriculture back in those days. And he'd retired, of course, but he had a huge garden. And when I was young, I used to just follow him around like this limpet, sponging all the information. And he was really used to explain how plants grew, what soil did, how important things were in the environment. And I guess his amazing wisdom inspired me into, biological sciences or an interest in biology and plants and nature. So it was just hanging around with my granddad.
Oh, that's such a nice story to get into science. And then once you got into science, Nick, what kind of path did you take going through? Because you've had quite a varied career, haven't you?
Variable, very random. Eventually, after I grew up in Kaiapoi in North Canterbury, went to high school there, went to University of Canterbury. I decided I was going to do this and that. And then for some strange reason, I really got to detest thistles. So Californian thistles specifically, I guess another thing about weeds. And that really took me on an honours degree looking at the biological control of Californian thistles. So that sort of started the journey. And then I did my doctorate, another pivot. It was, again, microbial based, plant based, but it was looking at why clover was disappearing in our pastoral swards. So sort of a very agricultural degree, again, looking at plant pathogens and the soil biology, the soil ecosystem that our farmers, particularly dairy farmers, were contending with. Why was our white clover disappearing and what was the role of the soil community? So a lot of people know me as a tree hugger, but I often said, no, I really started with thistles and clover. So then I guess a postdoctoral position in Oslo, Norway, for the food and feed section of the Royal Veterinary Institute. And that was because one of my PhD supervisors, the late Dr. Margaret Demena, I was her last student, and she was one of the first female mycologists to graduate in New Zealand. So at the grand old age of 82, she was my key supervisor, and she was an emeritus at that stage. So she had worked all across the world and had said, oh, no, you need to go overseas. You've done all your education in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you need to widen yourself now. So she had said, why don't you go and look at this research in Norway, which was looking at the food safety around harvesting organic crops and the organic food, which was a huge industry coming with people wanting to eat organic. But what was the food safety implications? So I went there and I met people working on polar bears. I met people, every imaginable thing. People developing salmon as an industry and what diseases struck salmon. So it was quite a weird and varied career, just my education. So that's at least an explanation of becoming a generalist, but it also gave me experiences of working with different disciplines, very different laboratories, people. Yeah, so it gave me that grounding, I guess.
Wow. It's a very exciting career path already, and we're only halfway through it. Dave, you've had a very globe-trotting path into science as well, haven't you?
Yeah, certainly both hemispheres. I'm originally from the western part of the United States.
Couldn't tell.
Yeah,
No accent at all.
No accent. It's been a really good journey for me. I'm really a student of science and continue to be. It's one of those things where I really enjoy all aspects of learning about the world in which I move. And so, everything from, as a kid, I was really into paleontology and growing up in the Las Vegas Valley. It was a very desert environment. So, there are a lot of desert tortoises and lizards and snakes. And, my parents were very understanding when I would go out and catch these snakes and bring them back in and put them in a cage that they would eventually get out of, and they'd be in the house somewhere. And my mom was, bless her soul, she was so patient for that. but it was that kind of upbringing that really kind of drove me into pursuing science in all its different aspects. And like Nick, and I think you'll find that it'll be consistent among a lot of scientists, is that there's a very broad appreciation of all the areas of science.
And similar for you, Andrew?
Yeah, kind of. As a kid, I was really fascinated with science fiction, actually. That was a passion for me. And it's basically, I always thought about what is the potential for science to change the world, to do something new, to have an effect, in our daily lives or, environmentally or whatever. And that's always been a sort of a passion for me. So when I was at school, I sort of naturally affiliated with science and then into biology as well, because it felt kind of, it was a living science. That's what attracted me to it. It wasn't cold like chemistry. Sorry if I've offended any chemists out there, but for me, it was just the softness of the biology. Really fascination of me was, how does biology work? And then it came down to actually, how do the actual molecules of biology work? And so that's been a passion of mine, is proteins. And that sort of lent me on my journey. And like these guys, I've done diverse things. I did an honours degree at Auckland University, purifying potential human growth hormones out of human pituitary glands. Okay, so that was kind of my first entry into actually doing research. And then I jumped over to a PhD at the University of Sydney, working on a protein involved in DNA replication and trying to solve the structure of that using nuclear magnetic resonance, which is a spectroscopic technique. Massive magnets in a big room. You don't take your wallets in there because they stick to the magnet. And then I moved from that to the ANU and worked on a project looking to see if we could evolve proteins in the test tube. So speed up evolution and do it in a day rather than, millions of years on proteins. And after that, I went to Spain, of all places, to Madrid, which was fantastic, amazing culture, and worked on a protein involved in cell division. And after that, I was looking to come home to New Zealand because I've been away for 11 years and came back to Hort Research, which is now plant and food research, and jumped into insect odorant receptors. And I had no idea, I knew nothing about insects, but these proteins just sounded amazing. And that's led me, unbelievably, I keep sort of thinking every day, how did I end up here? Founding a company where we're developing a biosensor technology, which is using insect odorant receptors to basically sense the world, volatile organic chemicals as biomarkers for disease or whatever in humans and plants. So it's a technology with huge potential, but at the basis, it's the protein molecules, these workhorses. So yeah, it's been all over the place. Australia, Spain, New Zealand, all kinds of proteins, all different kinds of scientists, all different kinds of cultures. And that's what is amazing about science. It just crosses all those cultures. It's like another language, right? Whatever country you come from, there's a commonality there. And I'm pretty sure most scientists do it out of love. They do it because they want to have an effect on the world. They're passionate in helping people. That tends to be the fundamental nature of the people I've worked with, at least.
Go on, give us the plug, Andrew. What's the company's name?
Sentient Bio.
There you go. So clearly from our conversation, it's apparent that science can take you many different places and can make you wear many different hats. I guess before we jump into the next question, Nick, what's your role at the moment?
I'm affectionately or not known as a seagull, a science group leader, co-leader of an amazing group called PPE, or Plant Pathogen Environment.
Sounds like a cool group.
Yeah, very cool. Based in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, Mount Albert Research Centre.
And Dave, what about you?
Like Nick, I'm a science group leader as well. I lead the adaptive entomology group in the bioprotection portfolio. I have teams scattered across both islands, Auckland, Hawke's Bay, Motueka, and Lincoln.
Andrew.
And I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Sentient Bio, and we're actually at Plant and Food Research embedded in there. So I actually haven't moved my desk since leaving Plant and Food Research.
We know that scientists like to hoard on their desks, so I'm sure that was a really good option for you. Cool. So clearly some very diverse career paths on the panel today. Thank you all for joining us. So scientists often talk about how flexible and diverse a science career is, and our conversation so far has been a good showcase of that. But I'm interested to know your opinions on how much room we actually have to grow and change fields as scientists. Andrew, would you like to start us off with that one?
I increasingly think there's just huge opportunities now because everything overlaps. Like in my one, it's nanotechnology and biotechnology and artificial intelligence, right? So these are all quite diverse fields. However, they're all interacting because we're creating a sensor device. So, and I'm sure with the other guys on the call, it's probably the same, that there's huge overlap now just with the expansion of the kind of science we're doing. You have to go and talk to people who are in different fields to be able to, achieve the things you want to achieve.
I imagine holding the SGL roles would have a lot of fingers and a lot of pies as well, wouldn't it, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually one of the best things about being an SGL is that you get to be a part of all these different directions in science research. And the teams that are doing the research, they often collaborate across portfolios, and so they're very multidisciplinary. And really, today's science world, that's the way it is. The idea of being a specialist or somebody that's very myopic in how they conduct their research, those days are kind of fading. It's really more about connecting and collaborating and recognizing the skill set that other people bring to an idea.
Similar experience for you, Nick?
Yes, if you look at when I started, it was very hierarchical, very narrow. The funding systems that often enabled research were very directional. And now it's moved into exactly what Andrew and David said around multiple disciplines, cross teams, cross organisations, international, local, and also into the realms of transdisciplinarity, which is even looking into beyond the science community, but recognising knowledge systems, whether they be Indigenous, whether they be from citizen or community science, or recognising that knowledge and ideas are everywhere. And some of the big picture areas in research, the answers are not held by one person or one, professor somewhere. It's held by a team or a community. And that community includes knowledge holders of all descriptions. And so it's become a real huge diversity of thought, of process, and of exploration.
Yeah, I have to say, when I've ever been struggling with my PhD, which is a lot of times, most of my problems have been solved in the cafeteria, talking to scientists from other research teams that I wouldn't normally get that chance to troubleshoot with. So it's amazing how collaborative science is now, and how you can work on proteins one day and then the next day you're working on thistle. It can change quite quickly, can't it? So talking about changing career paths, I think we'd all like to know, and particularly myself, what was a major pivot point in your career, and how did you decide to make that change? I think I'm going to send this one to Dave because I don't know if this is the one you're going to talk about, but I've got a particular interest in your story here.
Oh, well, my pathway, I'm definitely on a 4 or 5 year cycle in my career about changing. I had a hard time in college at uni because every class I would take, I would go, oh, that's what I want to do, So I changed majors like, I don't know, a dozen times, honestly. And so I have had a very broad science career. I was a high school physics teacher, which, and I taught, physics 1, physics 2, and then a college level physics course. And it was just really fantastic, that experience of sharing, my excitement for the physical world. But I was a biologist at heart, and at a certain point, I wanted to do something else. And so I have the confidence in myself that I knew that if I went and pursued something else, that if it failed, I could always go back to teaching. And so I went into entomology just because I like bugs. And I think that you can imagine the most bizarre life form on any planet in the universe, and there will be an analogous insect somewhere that does something very similar to it, right? So that in and of itself is a very diverse group. So if you become an entomologist, I mean, you could be doing like what Andrew does and look at olfactory, or you could do stuff like what Nick does, where you look at, vectored pathogens, or, I mean, they just cover a wide area. And so that makes career shifting quite easy. So I went and I got my degree in entomology at the University of Arizona. At that time, I was studying biological control and melon and cotton. And then I did a postdoc in urban entomology, where I was looking at termite communities, subterranean termite communities in an urban setting, that transitioned into looking at subterranean termites in an ecological setting and the competition between those colonies or those species. And that transitioned into a job with the USDA ARS, where I worked in post-harvest entomology to break trade barriers for key pests. And so at the time, I was brought in by the Table Grape Commission to work specifically on breaking the trade barrier that had been put in by New Zealand and Australia, prohibiting the shipment of California table grapes into New Zealand and Australia. And so I had to break that trade barrier, and that was successful, fortunately, after a year and a half. And then I went to the Ocean Spray Cranberries, where I worked as an agricultural scientist. And at that point, I had to learn about pathogens and weeds and IPM programs and fruit quality and fruit storage and soils and fertilizers. I had to learn about all that stuff, and that's exciting. And then at a certain point, this was all in the western part of the U.S. At a certain point, I realized that the U.S. no longer culturally was aligning with my own personal values, and I, as having a family, I wanted to have my family in the best possible place. And so we came, there was a job opening at PFR, and I could have gone to Palmerston North or Motueka, two different aspects. And I had never been, I had only seen New Zealand on internet and TV programs and stuff. So I had no idea what it was about. So I reached out to a couple of people that I knew here, and they go, "Oh, you got to go to Motueka." So yeah, then I'm here doing apple and pear entomology, and yeah.
So here's my terrible crack at an analogy of your career, which is that if your career path has been driving along a motorway, it's been very much a changing of lanes rather than throwing a U-turn in terms of your career pivots. It's been quite transitional.
Yeah, so there's an expression we have in the US, and it's funny, I was just talking about that with a colleague today, this morning, that there's an expression where people will say, let's take the blue roads or let's take the blue highways. And in the US, in the old maps, when instead of mobile phones and apps, when you had paper, you would fold it out and the major highways would either be in yellow or red. And then there would be these little blue roads that were kind of off on the side. And so the expression, let's take the blue roads, it often leads to new and interesting and unexpected things. Because you're traveling roads that aren't usually traveled. And so when I think of my career, I love traveling the blue roads. And so when there's an opportunity to take a path that is not typical, I'll do that.
I love that. That's such a cool analogy. Way better than my motorway one.
No, it's exactly like your motorway.
Nick, as someone who else has traveled a lot of blue roads, what have been some sort of major pivot points in your career, and how did you decide to take the blue roads in those situations?
Well, I think Dave really summarised that superbly around the inquisitive nature that the science career gives you and provides you, and the foundational tools of what you learn. Like you might be thinking, oh my gosh, this thesis, but it gives you skill sets like perseverance. It equips you with a whole lot of skill sets. It's not just looking down a microscope or digging up a soil or looking at a gene function. It's giving you a whole lot of skill sets, whether it's presenting, because writing, meeting people, conferences, explaining your ideas. So the toolbox that a science researcher gains through the education and then the jobs and other parts give you that opportunity to explore those. If you are going back to the motorway, it's giving you not just how to drive, but that whole way to work. And you can, a scientist, researcher can work anywhere in terms of any organization, because those skill sets are needed. And so I guess that's a real key part of what we do is using our thought, our thinking, but also those other resources, how to do a budget, how to convince people, about the worthiness of what you're doing. And so I guess is that in terms of my pivots, sometimes the pivots are forced upon you. Like, I think if you talk to any researcher globally, we're always talking about the instability of funding. Research grants come to an end. 1 minute it's the flavor of the month of government or commercial funding, and they pivot their funding somewhere else. So you have to also be really agile to go where the funding is as well. So that can also be the pivot is forced upon you. And I was in a place in one of the other CRIs, and we just lost our funding, and it was in a real critical area. I was working with the late Ross Beaver on plant pathogens in the native estate or the native environment, and it was the emergence of the sickening forests due to Cody dieback or Phytophthora agathodicida. And we had the naysayers saying, these are ecologists, saying, oh, that's just forest succession, trees die, there's cohort declines, and, we don't think it's a real thing. That's just what trees do, come and go. It's dynamics. And we were going, no. But I just thought, I can't bear this anymore. I have to do something meaningful somewhere else. And I went and applied for a role at Auckland Regional Council, because they were the agency that were fundamentally having to manage the on-the-ground forest biosecurity, forest health management for the region's Cody forests. And I thought, well, if I can't understand and get funding to explore this organism more, I have to go and follow this path somewhere else. And so my pivot was applying for a role in the biosecurity team. And I worked for 10 years in local government and learned all sorts of things from all sorts of specialists across biodiversity, across infrastructure, engineering, all sorts of areas. And it was a way I pivoted and really enjoyed the experience. Very political. You're masters of the mayor and the councillors, and fronting up to politicians on a daily basis about what you're doing, why you're doing it, going to those committee meetings and saying why the parks department needs this funding to manage, what they're doing, whether it be Cody dieback or possums or visitor assets or tracks. It really gave a different world view, I think. And also I had to front up to town halls. I had to go to community. I had to talk in libraries. I had to face many adversarial, let's say, situations, highly conflicted situations where communities have all sorts of ways of where they locally want to manage what they do. And I learned so much for having to go into a town hall and say, this is what's happening, these tracks are closing. And, you really it was quite stressful, but it was also a pivot in local government, gave me a huge experience around implementation of science, because I then wasn't doing the microscopy or the genetics work or whatever was informing what Cody dieback was and is and how do you manage it. I had to work with the funding then did return to some of the Crown Research Institutes and some of the universities, and I worked with some of my former colleagues and others to try and give us the answers on the ground as a managing organisation. So I became part of that implementation pathway. I had to use the research of others to then translate it in how we worked in biosecurity or parks management. So that gave me another insight into the science pathway. It's great exploring it, but where are you taking it and what does it mean on the ground, or where is it going? Is it going to be in a journal that no one reads, or is it going to make a meaningful change or difference or inform something somewhere, even if it's informing other scientists or academics or other researchers around what then they take? Every part is important, but it really taught me a lot about implementation and working with the community, which I thought I knew how to do. I tell you what, I didn't.
It really went from lab coats to community hall, I suppose, for you in that pivot point. How cool. Andrew, what about you? You've had quite a fairly recent career pivot.
I've had a pretty massive career pivot, but I was just thinking what these guys are saying about how they got into it. And I just remembered when I did my honours degree, and I did really well at University of Auckland, and I had a PhD lined up at Imperial College in glycosylation of proteins. And I was all set to go to that. And then I didn't get the scholarship. And it kind of hit me really hard. And I thought, hold on, I thought I was good enough, right? And I wasn't good enough. So I can remember sitting there for a couple of months. I was on the dole for the only time in my life, going, what am I going to do? Because I didn't have this, my blue lane, well, my lane was gone there. And so then I just decided I was going to write away to every single department in Australia, because it was just across the ditch, and say, hey, I'm Andrew, and this is what I'm interested in. Have you got a job? Can you give me a job, basically? And I got a reply from one guy, Glenn King, who was interested in having me, and he was doing nuclear magnetic resonance on proteins. And I thought, protein structure, that might be really cool to get into. And he organised me a 6-month scholarship to get over there. So I got over there, and then I had to start applying for more scholarships to keep me going. But I was really fortunate to get into that. And so that took me down that protein pathway. And that took me all the way to Spain. And, like most New Zealand, well, maybe not most New Zealanders, but a lot of New Zealanders want to get the hell out of here and see the world. A lot of them don't come back, right? And so at the end of that the postdoc over there, I had to make the decision, what am I going to do? Am I going to keep, Spain's a pretty great place to stay. They got great food, great wine, everything. It's a good lifestyle there. Or do I come back to New Zealand? And I'd been away for about 11 years, and I thought it's time for me to come back and try and give it a go, which was kind of scary to come back. And so how do I get back, right? Because the opportunities at the time in New Zealand, they've grown a lot now. There weren't a lot. So I went around and talked to people here, and I thought, okay. And then I talked to Richard Newcomb, who's the chief scientist of plant and food research, and he sold me a fantastic story around insect odorant receptors and how interesting they are, just in the life cycle of insects, how how these determine how insects actually read the world. It's their primary sense, and how important these receptors are for, controlling insects. If you can block these receptors, they won't go and attack plants, for example. So this is pretty cool stuff. But then he told me there were membrane proteins, and membrane proteins are probably the most horrible proteins in the world to work with because they hate water. But I thought this sounds fantastic. There's huge potential there to do something, in fundamental research and in applied research. So I jumped into that, and then I think we applied for a grant. No, I got a forced fellowship to make these receptors and stick them on a sensor. 3 years. I thought I could do that in 3 years, but it took 20 years. And that's how long it took. It took not only me, but a lot of the team working out how to make these receptors. That took about 10 years. And then we got IP on how you can get them to work on the sensors. And then the second major pivot point was Kiwi Network for Innovation. And I got this little Emerging Innovator Award, which was $30,000. And it doesn't sound much, but it did a lot. It meant that me and the team could do some crucial experiments to get our IP, to get some patents around these proteins and putting them on sensors. And that really was the pivot point, because now it opened up this door to the world of commercialization. And I'm thinking of Darth Vader here. Everybody thinks commercial, they think the dark side. They are human on the dark side. They're not all, they don't all dress in black and breathe heavily. So it opened me to that world and to considering going down this path of commercialization, which I think for a lot of scientists, myself included, is like, no thanks. I just want to do the science. I just want to focus on that. But when you get to a point with whatever idea you have and you've exhausted pretty much the funding you can get out of government streams, you have to think about how to take it forward. And that's where the commercial side comes in. That's where investors are so important, because they're willing to put up money to see if your idea will come to fruition. But you have to change the way you think, right? You have to be able to share with the investor the value of the opportunity, what it could lead to. And, it's all about making money in the commercial world. But that is the fastest way to get a technology off the ground, right? Because otherwise you won't be able to do it in a CRI. It's great to work up the idea, but it's just not going to happen. So that's what made me decide to go on this adventure to see if we could take it out and do something like create a sensor. And it's very much a moonshot idea. It's a big idea, which when we succeed, it will have a massive impact. And so there's a lot more risk than other ideas with startups, but that's what makes it exciting, because it's just the sheer potential of what this technology could do. And I always liken it to the impact of the camera in the 20th century and how that has just changed the way we interact with the world, not only just taking photographs, but video streaming, YouTube, whatever, TikTok or whatever, if you're into that. That's all because of that camera, right? So there's huge potential of being able to sense these volatile organic chemicals, which are biomarkers for the state of your body or the state of a crop or whatever. So that's made me jump in this totally new direction. And I never imagined I would be where I am now. But I think like the other guys, I tend to sort of jump in the deep end and maybe, mind you, when I made this step, I talked to a lot of people about the challenges of doing a startup and going from being a scientist and into the business world. So I made sure I did a lot of research on that before I made that decision to go in that direction.
So I guess, Andrew, as someone who's, been there and doing that currently, what advice would you give to someone who's wanting to pivot their career? And I guess this question is really asking, how can we move from Gumboots to the Boardroom and then maybe even back again?
Right. Well, the first thing I would say is what I just said, is reach out to people. Go and talk to people who are in that area you're thinking of going into. That's the most important, because at the end of the day, it's the people, right? I mean, the science is all very fantastic, but if you can't work with the people, it's going to be very challenging. Because science, at its essence, is collaboration. It's collaboration of minds, getting on the same playing field and being able to talk the same talk, right? So there's that, and there's the other thing, which is kind of, I guess, leaning into fear, which is the fear of making a mistake, the fear of the unknown. Oh, it's a different field. Will I be able to understand it? And it's the fear of other people are going to think of you by doing that, because you're in your lane. And as Dave put it, you're going on a blue lane. You're going to decide, I'm going down this blue lane, and what are my peers going to think of me? And that can impact some people from taking that step. And that's the key thing, is to push yourself out there, lean into it and go and meet people and go and talk to people about the area you want to get into, and not be afraid to make that jump. Because like I think Nick was saying, all the skills you've gathered being a scientist are transferable, right? And so, hey, if it doesn't work out, there's always other options out there. I hope that helps. I don't know.
I'm guessing you'd have similar advice, Nick.
Oh, definitely. And there's, as Andrew says, there's key people that you think, wow, or people that you can recognize in their careers, they've done things or gone places or achieved things that, if you are wanting to go to the boardroom, connect to leaders, connect to people that you admire or want to get to, and talk to them. And really often they will take you as into mentorship or building those skills, or ask them how they got there. What would you do to get from A to B? Like, that's where I think I want to go. Of course, you might find exciting opportunities along the side and you may not, but that I think Andrew's right, talk. And I think that we're in a great community if people are genuinely interested in each other and what each other's research is and skills. And so use those opportunities. And also we're now, virtually meeting all sorts of people now that either you don't have to physically be there, but I guess also the importance of things like conferences or other meetings. It's like you are actually connecting into a worldwide network of experts and leaders and people that you are, or with those skill sets that you really think that's where I want to head. So, and as you said, commercialization, there's business, there's that whole area. I mean, if that's what makes you tick, go into those and talk to those people. So yes, I think that's a really good advice, is just making sure you talk to the people that you think will have that advice, and then make sure you choose your directions wisely too. But don't be afraid to make mistakes, because you can always come back to something else. And there's lots of employers, and there's lots of, as Andrew said, you can email people and say, hey, I need a job, or there's always a network you can get back into. And I think you've always got your background of where you've been and what you've done, and you can show the sort of person you are. And so never be afraid. But I do think, sometimes people, oh, no, stay this, don't, but I think our sector is very changeable, and you can go in all sorts of paths. So I think that was perfect advice, Andrew.
Sorry, I just want to jump in, because I just wanted to also share that I've found that people, when you talk to these people, a lot of them are incredibly generous. A lot of them want to give back, these successful people. It's just, I don't know why, it's just a lot of people are like that. So don't be disheartened if you meet somebody who isn't, because let me assure you, there are people out there. So just keep trying, keep knocking on doors. And what people like to see is enthusiasm and passion and a willingness to learn. Okay, so just be open, right? That's the best way to get through that door.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of add to what Nick and Andrew have said, and it's really interesting to look at the commonality in each of our diverse experiences. There's a huge underlying thread of commonality, and that is the willingness and the ability to engage and communicate with others. And so communication ultimately, it's why I went into education in the first place, and it's a huge part of science, right? We have to communicate. When you really get down to it, we are isolated, unique individuals, and we can have brilliant ideas, but unless we share those ideas, communicate those ideas effectively to those around us, those ideas will never manifest. They'll never go anywhere, right? And so, whether it's Nick communicating at the town hall meetings, or whether it's Andrew reaching out to scientists in Australia to see if he could get funding out there, right? So there's all kinds of ways to communicate in all aspects, and each of those is important. And I would say too that early in my career anyways, there was a selfish aspect to it. And the selfishness was about the joy of personal scientific discovery. For instance, I worked on this parasitoid herbivore system in cotton and melons when I was a grad student. And I learned so much about this one parasitoid. And I found it so exciting that in the millions of years that this parasitoid had evolved, and in the thousands of years of human culture, nobody had looked at this. And so I was the first. And so when I discovered those things, that was a very special and selfish moment. As I advanced in my career, I began to realize that that I had the ability to be in positions to where I could share the opportunity for others to experience that aha moment. And so when you talk about transitioning from different aspects of your career, it is something that, as Andrew said, that there are a lot of really good people that want to help out there. And I think it's easy to find those people if you're persistent in your communication. So, yeah, for sure.
It's cool to see common advice from three people with very different career paths. So it's very encouraging. It's sort of leaning into the fear, making sure that you're communicating well. And I'd also add following your passions, making sure that you're doing what you want to do rather than what you're being told to do would be probably an important one as well. Hey, if you've listened to this podcast before, you may have heard me talking about how I didn't think that science was the career path for me when I was a bit younger, because I wasn't really keen on the idea of being stuck alone in a lab, crazily working at lab work at all hours of the day, which is pretty ironic because it's exactly what I ended up doing anyway. But I wonder, do you think the image of a scientist is stopping people getting into science? The kind of old image of someone working away in a lab with no friends at all hours of the day. Do you think this is actually becoming a barrier to people beginning to move into their science careers? Nick, did you want to take this one?
Oh, kia ora. There's the popular culture perception of the geek. Always the glasses, no friends. I think the Big Bang Theory exploded that to find that geeks have lives and loves and interests and are really quite fascinating and creative. But there is that popular culture perception. So I do think that was an impediment, I think. But also the career pathways are never explained very well. Exactly what you said. Oh, I'm going to be a lab rat. I'm going to be in a lab by myself at midnight doing this. If you want to be in the lab alone at midnight, you can, but you don't have to. And I don't think the career advice is that you can. It's open and wide and global and connected. I don't think the career advice is very good. And the other perception, I think, at some points there is a misconception that scientists are evil. And I don't know, in some parts of the world, but in New Zealand, there's been some shocks for the public when, for example, the Royal Commission on Genetically Modified Organisms. And I remember being in the science sector then, and we were number 3. There was car salesmen, lawyers, and real estate agents, car salesmen, and scientists, because the community suddenly found out we, as a community, were doing things that they didn't know or approve of. So the word social license or cultural license, that was an awakening for our sector to realize that the community does have an opinion on what research grants or funding goes to, because mostly comes from the taxpayer or the business community, as Andrew's gone along. But if you're starting those gestation of ideas in government laboratories on grants, on Marstons, on MBs, on Forsts, that comes from the taxpayer. And so there was a suspicion that grew into what we did. And, we're often in campuses with no access, and there's a mystery around it. So you get that sort of perception in popular culture, and then what these institutes mean, the ivory towers, there is that reputation. So we do have to overcome that, and we are, through things like social license, through the teaching of science in our schools and things like that, to really open and bring the classroom into the institutes. Like here at Kitty Kitty, there's a teaching room where it looks out on the orchards and the secondary schools, and come in and they learn and they see horticulture in action. Well, I think there are a lot more outreach and education programs are debunking those old perceptions. But yeah, I can sort of see why they have arisen with some people. And some people look at you strangely at a water cooler or at a bar or at a party in the kitchen, and you'd say, "What are you doing?" And they start to look back away from you. So you still have that, but then they realise you're okay.
Dave, what about for you?
Yeah, again, it kind of comes down to communication. And I think scientists, historically, I would argue it maybe not so much today, and the trend is moving away from this, but historically have been, let me do my thing, let me focus on my specialty area. And they are good about writing papers and communicating with their scientific peers, but have been really bad at social communication. And so we see this trend worldwide of a distrust of scientific information. And as scientists, we are to blame for that because we don't communicate with the public. So, Aaron, the thing that you're doing right now, these podcasts you can't place a value on how important they are because it is this communication with the public.
I think it's also been really cool through the podcast to address the representation issue with science as well, that we're not all one kind of person in science anymore. It's very diverse.
That's exactly it, right? I mean, we are a reflection of the classrooms that we grew up in, right? So there's a diverse, I think of the world as a classroom, and you have the students that sit in the front row and they're always raising their hand and eager to answer questions. And then there's this group that's in the middle that just kind of wants to do what they need to make it work, but they don't want a lot of attraction, attention. And then there's the group that sits in the back with their arms crossed and very much like, hey, I'm not involved in this in any way, and I'm going to be a little antagonistic. Those people, those personalities don't change when they go out into the world. And you can take a look at any profession, and there is a cross section of those people that exist within that system. And so as scientists, there are those that are in the front raising their hands, there are those in the middle doing what they need to, and then there are those that are actually antagonistic. And so we are just like everybody else, and we've chosen a career just like everybody else. I mean, it just happens to be in science. And I think science can take a lot of different perspectives. So I'm kind of reminded of, I worked at a planetarium doing star talks. And there was, in the Northern Hemisphere, I don't know much about the Southern Hemisphere stars, but I got involved with this guy that was an optical engineer. And we developed this interactive laser show that he and I put together. He did all the engineering. I just kind of talked about how to go through things with him, but we would have this keyboard, and depending upon the keys that you would press, it would generate different X, Y, Z axis projections of multicolored lasers. And you could blur them and do all this stuff, and you had a little joystick, and then you had an equalizer that you could change the width of the light and all this stuff. And so we would have these laser shows that, Pink Floyd and Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Metallica. It was absolutely one of my favorite jobs ever. And you're using science to create art that is ephemeral, right? The laser show is art that disappears. And that's science, right? That whole thing comes about through science. And so when you talk about science careers, it could be anything, right? So that's pretty cool.
Andrew, how about for you?
I actually think we're improving, and I think, I know the COVID pandemic's been a nightmare for the world, but it's really brought scientists out of their shells, because science is now in the public forum, right? We're talking about viruses, we're talking about all that stuff, and people know a lot more about it. And, the likes of Susie Wiles and other scientists who've had the courage to stand up and give an opinion and be ready to be challenged about it, and unfortunately get the hate mail as well. Those are the people who are paving the way. And it comes down again to communication. Yeah, showing that we're humans. We're not the subset of people who can't interact with others when we are. Getting out there and speaking to people. And it's also showing that doing a science degree is a stepping stone, not just to being a lab rat. And I just want to say, you may be a lab rat now because you're doing a PhD, but as you go on in your career, you won't be so much of a lab rat, right?
I'll miss the lab. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of it, is you're doing the hard yakka now to get your PhD, but then you've got it, and then the world kind of changes. You probably feel at the moment, I'm getting all on you here, but you probably feel like it's all on me. I've got to achieve something. It's my project. If I can't make it work, it's going to fail. Well, that's irrelevant, because it's applying the scientific method, which is what you're doing, and whatever happens, happens. And then once you get out and do a postdoc or whatever else you do, you're going to be working as a team. I mean, you're probably in a team already, but it won't feel so much on your shoulders. So everybody out there, you're not going to be a lab rat for the rest of your life if you do science. But it does offer the options to go into the business side, to go into IP, be an IP lawyer, be a teacher, or, like Dave could go back and be a teacher, doing science again if he wanted to. There's a whole plethora of options there where you can take it, and jumping fields or working with the public like Nick did a lot of. It's this one step of starting into science can open all these doors, which you'd never think of. And take me, for example, I'm in a boardroom now, right? So I think it's just letting people know that it's not this narrow lane. It's a massive freeway, right, with multiple lanes and all these blue lanes going off it. And it's up to you whether you make the choices and whether you take the risks to try new things or not. But it's not being afraid of change. And I think science is fantastic. If you're passionate about helping people and changing the world, then science is one area where you could have a massive impact. Even if you're doing the small stuff in the lab, it all adds up to a bigger lot of knowledge, right, which can have impact.
No, I agree with you there, Andrew, especially on your point about the image of a scientist changing and becoming better in society. I do a little bit of teaching at the university, and every single student knows who Susie Wiles is. Yeah. And I think that's so cool that the image of a scientist isn't some, dare I say it, old white guy hidden away in a lab.
Exactly.
Going crazy. It's now people like Susie Wiles, which is so cool. So definitely great to see the improvements there. And I guess one last fun question to round us out for today's podcast. What is the most unexpected place your science career has taken you? Dave, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I think probably the most unexpected place and location for me, it would be easy to say New Zealand, right? And I mean, never in a million years would I have ever thought I would consider myself an American trapped in. So I have a Kiwi soul trapped in an American body. So I do consider this my home, and it's weird that I'm here. But I would say there were times where I found myself like when I was working for Ocean Spray Cranberries, probably the oddest thing. So when they harvest fresh cranberries, they have this thing. It's called a Furford picker, and it's like a giant lawnmower type thing that pulls the berries off. And around the edges of the bog, it's hard to get all the cranberries, and so they sit on the vine, and they tend to ferment. And then the black bears would come down in the spring, and they would feed on these fermented cranberries, and they'd get intoxicated. and then they would just lay around in the beds, squishing the cranberry vines. And so there was one point I remember standing in this grower's cranberry field. We were in a bog, and we were looking out, and sure enough, there was a black bear laying down. So he and I were chasing this black bear out of a cranberry bed. and I thought, as I was chasing it, I thought about all the life's events that led to this particular point. And I thought, that is so surreal. But yeah, that was probably the oddest place that I've found myself in my career.
What about you, Nick?
Well, since Aotearoa, New Zealand is my place in space, I'll give you a Brazilian story then. Corpus Christi, the statue of Christ that overlooks Rio de Janeiro on the Sugarloaf. Simon Fowler, entomologist from Landcare Research, and I were on a mission to find Tradescantia, which was a weed in New Zealand, but it comes from Brazil. And the Sugarloaf has had records of this Tradescantia plant, which was quite rare or hard to find in Brazil. And we were up there, and we went up as a tourist, although we had been looking in the park that had been shut because the park's people were on strike. So they had security guards around all their, I guess, public parks. So we couldn't go in and foray for looking for Tradescantia. So we went up to Corpus Christi, and we were sort of doing the photos, old school film, and then we looked down, and like there were Tradescantia sort of coming up from the cliffs, growing up into, and we were sort of dangling over, I mean, now it's probably, and we were collecting bits and pieces of this plant on the Corpus Christi overlooking Rio de Janeiro, hoping that was either a bug or a pathogen was on these plants. And I thought, wow, this is spectacular. I've still got photos of it. So I guess that's the strangest place, but it was all in the name of finding control for weeds.
Sounds like another point where you just sort of take a stock take of all of your decisions leading up to this point and think, wow, isn't science such a fun pathway to go on? How about you, Andrew?
I don't have any of these amazing war stories like these guys, but I guess the most exciting place it took me, well, actually, I've got two answers here. The most exciting place it took me was Spain, to Madrid, working there and living in another culture and having to learn to speak another language. And I have the fondest memories of going to language school, being with people from all around the world, Brazil, Sweden, Germany, so many different people. And most of the time, the only way you could communicate with them was through Spanish because they couldn't speak English. And for me, it really brought out another side of me. I don't know if you've ever learned another language, but when you speak Spanish, I'm quite agitated anyway, but it just gets me even more excited, and you get more Latin, and it was wonderful. And the culture there, totally different. You know, the biggest night of the week was Thursday night. That's when everybody went out and partied, and then they'd recover at work on Friday to get ready for the weekend. So it brought me out of my shell, that's for sure. I guess the other area which is unexpected is the boardroom, which is where I am now. And that's been a real education because now I'm not dealing with scientists, I'm dealing with investors, people who've invested in our company and who are excited about the technology but don't have that know-how about the intricacies of it. And so I've had to really push myself to communicate to them and make sure they understand what they're doing. And the challenging thing I've had is making calls on things when you don't have all the data set, which is what you're used to in science. You collect all the data and you make your call, right? You you publish that paper. But with a spin out, you literally, everyone told me it's going to be like a roller coaster, and it is like a roller coaster. You have to get the results, or you have to pivot, or whatever. So, and the people I work with, they bring in their own perspectives, and it's been great working with these people, and I've learned so much about how that side of the world works. So that for me has been very unexpected. I never thought I'd end up in a boardroom, but yeah, a scientist can be in a boardroom, right? So it's all on the table. Yeah.
It's where that blue road took you. How cool. Hey, well, thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us today. Hopefully our discussion has encouraged someone out there to give science a go, or inspired someone who's already in their science career to make that leap into the career path that maybe they've kind of been working towards for some time. And thank you out there for listening. Please check out our SIS pages on our Plant and Food website for extra links and photos on the topics covered today. Please subscribe to our channel on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider, and don't forget to post a review and rate this podcast. See you next time.